What are some horrifying historical facts that most people don't know about? The Franklin expedition in 1845 to find the Northern Passage would be a faster route when traveling and freighting cargo across the Northern Hemisphere to Asia and China. The ships got caught in the ice and therefore stuck there forever. The crew turned to cannibalism as a way to survive in the cold and stayed on the lower decks of the ships where they'd eventually get very sick because of malnourishment. One of the ships was named Terror. Ironically, there's a book about it, which of course puts in some supernatural elements to the story. I, however, think the real story is creepy in its own right. Imagine being stuck in the ice, it's cold as fuck everywhere, there's no food left, and the nights are very dark. You forgot the grimmest part. None of the decisions they made mattered anyway. They were all as good as dead since their drinking water was spiked with toxic levels of lead. Engineers advised NASA to postpone the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger due to concerns about the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters at low temperatures. They were overruled, largely because the next launch window wasn't on a school day, and having students watch the first teacher launch to space was a big PR goal. As everyone knows, that launch failed because an O-ring in one of the SRBs failed. That, as bad as North American slavery was, it was far worse for the slaves sold in South America. The average life expectancy was 6 months, 2 if you were working in a mine. About 35%, or 11 million, of all slaves were sent to Brazil. 5%, 388,000, were sent to the US. Despite this, the US had more slaves than Brazil at all times, solely because the slaves in Brazil died so many and so quickly. Vikings would use pigments to make their teeth permanently one color by using a hammer and a sharp pick to make indentations for the dye in the enamel. This could be how the Danish king Harald Bluetooth got his name. That in 1961, the US almost accidentally nuked Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 carrying 2 3-ish megaton bombs took off out of the Air Force Base there, but the plane was leaking fuel. The pilot ordered everybody to eject and the plane broke apart before impact. The bombs required 4 separate arming switches to be activated to actually detonate. So, the pilot was more worried about his crew. 5 made it, but sadly 3 still died either in the crash or in the ejection. The bombs both hit the ground with only very minor damage and obviously did not detonate. However, upon recovery, somehow one bomb had 3 of its 4 arming mechanisms activated. One simple, low voltage switch was all that kept a bomb roughly 250 times stronger than the one dropped on Hiroshima from going off in North Carolina. In 1917, on the morning of December 6th, a Norwegian ship and a French cargo ship crashed into the Richmond district of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, setting off an explosion that killed 2,000 and injured another 9. There's actually an amazing story about a train dispatcher called Vince Coleman. He stayed in the ruined city, dying from the aftermath of the explosion, so that he could send a message to 2 trains that were meant to arrive in the station that day, saving hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. This was his message. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Mexico was in the middle of a civil war, and the government of Benito Juarez signed a treaty in which they basically sold in perpetuity the right of passage through Mexico to the US for both commerce and troops, in exchange for $4 million to finance the fight against the conservative faction in the Reform War. It also gave the US the rights to all benefits derived from that passage and trade, the right to military intervention in case of any threat to passage, and banned Mexico from creating similar treaties with any other country. It wasn't ratified by the US government because they were afraid that it would favor Confederate states. This was shortly before the American Civil War. So Juarez was almost selling our sovereignty to the US in exchange of financing his side on that civil war. It doesn't appear in our history books because Juarez is treated as our particular version of Jesus Christ, and he never did anything wrong. Well, I'm hoping that most of you here are aware of this, but I have been surprisingly shocked at how few people around me seem to have known this. But the influenza pandemic of 1918 that killed more people than World War I was absolutely terrifying. Children used to sing, "I knew a little bird, her name was Enza. I opened up the window, and influenza." The flu started in Kansas when some military soldiers were burning pig manure in a field. The flu then spread and killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. More Americans were killed from this virus than Americans were killed in every single war in the 1900s combined. It all happened in a 5-month window. The 60s scoop. Many people have read about the residential school system in Canada, which is brutal on its own. But learning about the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their homes and given up for adoption, was quite horrifying, seeing as how it happened in the 1960s. There is no mention of this in any social studies classes, and it seems Canadian kids are not taught about this. Probably somewhat well known, but it was a unit of Japanese scientists that conducted experiments on Chinese civilians during World War II. Not nearly as many deaths as the Holocaust, but I think it should be just as infamous. The things these innocent people were subjected to made me want to vomit just reading about it without pictures. I read about it a while ago, but some of the stuff I remember was freezing a person nearly to death and then dropping them in boiling water, forcing people with syphilis to have sex with clean people, and I'm pretty sure that's some of the tamer stuff. And they didn't do these things for any other reason than they were curious what would happen. The worst part, after the war, the main scientist guy got off with just having his mail read by Americans for the rest of his life. He exchanged all of his research for escaping punishment for his horrible crimes against humanity. Apparently, a lot of his research was useful and jumped our understanding of the human body by a big margin. It's scary how much of our medical understanding comes from stuff like this. De Pazzi family really hated the de Medici family due to the power of the latter over Florence. We're talking 1478 here, to the point where they plotted an assassination against them and killed Giuliano de Medici, but only injured his brother Lorenzo. Oh boy, did he get revenge. The people of Florence killed some of the members, but after that, he eliminated and imprisoned everyone involved in the plotting, and also did the same to the remaining members of the De Pazzi family. Bernardo Badini was able to escape by going to Constantinople, and even then, Lorenzo was able to have him captured and executed. As an Irishman, maybe it's not totally unknown, but I think the actual reality of what happened during the British occupation seems to be unknown to most people outside Ireland, even in Britain. It was 800 years. Most shockingly, the famine is just sort of known as some sort of act of God that plagued the entire country. The reality of what happened, that the famine only applied to certain members of society, and how/why it happened, just all seem to be swept under the rug. Calling it a famine is quite disingenuous. To this day, people still make jokes about Irish people and their love for potatoes. There's a reason. There was nothing else left to us. And when that was gone, there was literally nothing else given to us, though there was actual food to be had. It's not that we loved them, it was basically, that's all you have, eat it or die of starvation. The World War II bombing event that killed thousands of fleeing Holocaust survivors as they were being transferred by ships to Scandinavia. Apparently, friendly RAF bombers were misinformed that the ships they were told to bomb were fleeing/attacking enemies. I've read that the bombers did not know the horror of their actions until much later. There was a lapse in our species where we went down to about 100 mating couples around 11,000 years ago. It was due to what Randall Carlson called a cataclysm of biblical proportions. We are a species with amnesia, Graham Hancock. It's terrifying that we are doing nothing to prepare for an asteroid impact or a coronal flare from the sun or even a virus for that matter. When discussing the Crusades, people mostly talk about the first four. There was a later, less mentioned one, fifth I believe, but I'm not 100% sure, in which the Christian Crusaders sent an army of children to fight under the impression that the enemy wouldn't kill children and they would easily win. Well, that didn't go according to plan. Yikes. History is written by the winners and conquerors, so we'll never know our true history, nor which side of a war truly committed the worst crimes. It's easy to blame the losing side for the acts the winners did in order to garner support and look good for future generations. History tells of human cruelty beyond imagination at times, and the majority of humans are decent enough, at least born with a moral compass and empathy. But then there are these individuals who show that they are perfectly capable of committing horrendous acts towards other living creatures. The fact that history tells of some of these cruel humans is pretty scary to me, because at any given time, there will exist people on this earth capable of doing the exact same thing as those humans in the past. China's Great Leap Forward, in which millions were forcibly put into communal housing units in an effort to collectivize and industrialize China. At the same time, Mao convinced everyone to make a shitty-ass backyard furnaces to melt metal and turn it into some magic metal or something. Newsflash, it didn't work. Everyone just melted their tools, wasted the metal, and now you've got a ton of food sitting in fields not being harvested. Ensue mass famine and disease from rotting food. Whole buildings full of harvested food would sit there while people starved outside. But don't worry, that's not real communism. China's Cultural Revolution, where they decimated wrong thinkers who criticized communism or Mao, or who thought capitalism was pretty good. Also, they tore down like all of their traditional Chinese buildings and cultural items. So now most of it is rebuilt fakes. Bonus, Chinese 100 Flowers campaign, where China encouraged intellectuals to express opinions on how the commies were running the country, only to then eliminate those same people immediately after they spoke up. During World War II, the Japanese let about 900 balloons go to travel across the Pacific. Large, hydrogen balloons carried across the Pacific by the jet stream that were meant to drop explosives and incendiary devices. They were called Fugo, and if you Google Japanese fire balloons, you can learn more about them. Some of them made it to the US, and one was found by a minister, his pregnant wife, and some students near Klamath Falls, Oregon, while they were on their way to a picnic. These were the only 6 combat deaths on the mainland during the war. Other balloons made it, but the only one I know of that caused any problems was the one that got caught in power lines in Washington and caused a blackout. The United States actively overthrew democracies for decades after World War II, contributing much to the chaos that characterizes the Middle East today, and therefore the terrorism that has come with it. I find this post interesting because the highest responses are about singular events, which are by no means not horrifying, but I personally find the systems that cause such events to be the most horrifying. For example, the torture in places such as Guantanamo Bay is horrifying, but the thought that the US created the situation that led to it by taking actions pushed by big businesses which are incentivized by capitalism, well, that is horrifying. But of course, it is also much more complex than a singular event. Partition of India in 1947, resulting in the creation of Pakistan and causing displacement of over 14 million people along religious lines. Estimates of casualties as a result of the ensuing violence are up to 2 million. Growing up in Pakistan, I heard stories from my grandparents and my dad's uncle who served in the army and barely survived the journey. Stories of trainloads of refugees being intercepted and people slain in mass. Most people know that India was created in 1947. I bet most people wouldn't know the level of violence and bloodshed surrounding this event. When Spain tried to break the Moroccan fight for independence from their colonist regime, the Rif War, and was on the losing side in 1924, the Spanish airdropped many chemical weapons, including mustard gas in the north of Morocco, which finally led them to win the war against the Berber people of Morocco. This was the second recorded use of the chemical weapon. They targeted crop fields, markets, rivers, and villages. They still have not recognized this disgusting act to this day. It still leads to a ridiculously increased density of cancer cases in the Rif area. Some reports say between 40 and 60% of all cancer patients in the country come from this small, populated area. My family originally is from that area, and the region with the indigenous Berbers is still marginalized to this day by the pro-Spain/Arab Moroccan government. There is still no specialized cancer treatment clinic in the area, and most people find themselves traveling 4+ hours to find treatment, if they can afford it at all to begin with.